Over the last few years, I've been studying and paying closer attention to when the New Testament uses Jewish prayer. I've noticed that all the blessings that make up the basic structure of a Jewish prayer service, the Shema, the Amidah, and the Aleinu, all appear in some form in the New Testament. This has really strengthened my identity as a Messianic Jew. When I pray from the Siddur, a Jewish prayer book, I am seeing parallels to the New Testament all throughout it. And when I read the New Testament, I am seeing parallels to the Siddur all throughout it. My identity as a Jewish person who follows Yeshua, Jesus, is reflected in the New Testament itself, which is a collection of Jewish texts that follow and revere Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah and Lord of all. Now, this is not to say all the theology expressed in every Siddur is the exact same or is even compatible with all the theology of the New Testament. This is far from the case, unfortunately, but there are many core prayers in the Siddur that provide natural pathways for me to express my faith in Yeshua. So I wanted to make a series of videos showing you guys what I've been finding, the Shema, the Amidah, the Aleinu, and even the Kaddish in the New Testament. Now, I'm not making any claim that later Jewish prayer is following the New Testament, or even that all the Jewish prayers we have today were common in the first century during Yeshua's day, especially in the form we have them today. The Jewish prayer book and final forms of these blessings took centuries after the destruction of the temple to be finalized and especially widespread. So all I am showing is that there are intensely strong parallels between Jewish liturgy and the liturgy of the New Testament, and maybe not liturgy, but even just how the New Testament phrases certain things that are core to its theology, which strengthen my Messianic Jewish faith and identity. While some of these parallels do have direct links to Jewish liturgy of the first century, as we'll see here with the Shema, not all of them do. Most of the parallels I attribute to the shared source of theology and of blessings that the New Testament and the later rabbis share, which of course is the Tanakh. And so in this video, as you see in the title, we will be looking at the Shema in the New Testament. So what is the Shema, if you do not know? The Shema is from Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. This is the pinnacle Jewish prayer, the foundation of Jewish theology in many ways. And it is a prayer that's said multiple times a day by religious Jewish people. And so for the purposes of this video, before we move on, I want to first look at the Greek version of Deuteronomy 6:4, which is from the Septuagint. Now, the reason why I want to point this out is because, of course, the New Testament, just like many other Second Temple Jewish texts, was written in Greek. So we want to look at how the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Tanakh that was put together from the 3rd through the 2nd century BC, how they translate the Shema into Greek. Because this was often what the New Testament was quoting and often what other Second Temple Jewish literature was quoting, because they were also writing in Greek, so it was only natural for them to do so. And so this was because at the time, especially where the Septuagint was probably translated in Egypt, but really all throughout the Roman Empire, Greek was the common language, especially being read by those who could read. And so the Jewish community, translators in the Jewish community, created the Septuagint in Greek as the common reading language. And like I said, massive amounts of Jewish literature at this time, the Second Temple period, were written in Greek. This includes texts like Josephus, Philo, First and Second Maccabees, many texts that we cite here all the time on Two Messianic Jews. In fact, if you want to read about a legend, it's actually a really fun read of how the Septuagint was created. You could read the letter of Aristeas as a Second Temple Jewish text that creates a story as to why and how the Septuagint was formed. Of course, it's a story and it's exaggerated and a little bit mythical, but it's fun to read nonetheless, and I think some good wisdom in there. Anyway, so Deuteronomy 6:4 in the Greek is Akue Israel Kurios Ha-Theos Hemon Kurios Haste Estin. So really the key word I want to point out there is haste. That is the word for one, and I'll explain more why later. But there's the Greek form of the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. Now, even though this was written in Greek, and we'll see later on that the Shema was being recited most likely as a liturgical blessing in the first century, it would have been in Hebrew still. But this is just from the Septuagint and how it takes its written form in Greek texts. All right, so this is the most straightforward one that we see in the New Testament, because we see Yeshua, Jesus, just straight up quoting the Shema. So Mark 12:28-31 says, "One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, 'Of all the commandments, which is the most important?' 'The most important one,' answers Jesus, 'is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.'" And there you see the Greek text matches what we see in the Septuagint. Well, right here I just have the Lord our God, the Lord is one in Greek. And then even more so, Yeshua goes on to quote the first sentence of the V'ahavta, so the continuation of the first paragraph of the Shema. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength." And then the second is this: "Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." So that's very straightforward, but also very important. Shows how important the Shema was to Yeshua and to the New Testament. Yeshua's answer to the question of what is the greatest commandment is the Shema. So just like it's pinnacle in Judaism today, the Shema was pinnacle for Yeshua and the Gospel of Mark and the New Testament right here. All right, and so before we go on to next versions of the Shema in the New Testament, it is important to point out that during the Second Temple period, the Shema was actually often abbreviated by Second Temple authors. So Josephus from Jewish Antiquities 3.91 is an example of this. He says, "The first word teaches us that God is one. Theos estin heis." There's our keyword there. Theos estin heis, one. God is one. And that he only must be worshipped. So this, I think, is actually a parallel in the idea that's coming across by Josephus of what we saw in Mark. Because I think it's interesting that Yeshua responds with the Shema to the question of what is the most important commandment. It's not even most important prayer, most important blessing, most important idea. So what's the most important commandment? And he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And here, Josephus is actually making the Shema a commandment himself. In fact, he's placing the Shema in the first commandment of the 10 Commandments. He says the first word teaches us that God is one, that he only must be worshipped. So even just the idea of the Shema being a command is paralleled here in Josephus in the Second Temple period. But all I'm trying to show here is that Josephus abbreviated the Shema to God is one, because that's what we'll see in the New Testament. And just for good measure, we see in much later, but still rabbinic Jewish literature, that the Shema was abbreviated even further. So this is an account of Rabbi Akiva, famous 2nd century rabbi, an account of his martyrdom found in Babylonian Talmud, Berachot 61b, where it says, when they took Rabbi Akiva out to be executed, it was time for the recitation of Shema, and it says he prolonged his uttering of the word one. So at least Rabbi Akiva abbreviated the Shema even further to just one word, one. So this is something that we'll see in the New Testament in multiple places. So the first one I'd like to go to is actually kind of cool. It's just kind of more of a fun one. The theology isn't as emphasized as what we see in Mark 12, but this is, I find this one really fun. So James 2:19 says, "You believe that God is one," the Shema. "You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder." So in Babylonian Talmud, Berachot 5a, we see Rabbi Yitzchak said, "Anyone who recites Shema upon his bed, demons stay away from him." So Babylonian Talmud, completed or at least in written form, in the 7th century AD, so hundreds of years after the New Testament, in Babylon, modern-day Iraq. So it's difficult to know how early the traditions contained in it go back. Some scholars find ways, especially from the Mishnah, a much earlier source in the 300s, go back to the New Testament, but even that's a little complicated, especially the Babylonian Talmud. However, nonetheless, I'm just pointing out parallels between Jewish tradition and the New Testament. And so it's interesting to me that James places the Shema as relevant to the context of demons being afraid, as does Rabbi Yitzchak do here when he says the Shema causes demons to stay away from him. So I think that's pretty cool. Now for Mark 2, 5 through 7. It says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Child, your sins are forgiven." Some legal experts were sitting there muttering among themselves, "Why does he speak this way? He's insulting God. Only the one God, Hes ha-theos, can forgive sins." Okay, so here, Yeshua is forgiving the sins of a paralytic child, and upon the forgiveness of their sins, they're able to get up and walk. And the Jewish legal experts there, they are very concerned, and they think Yeshua's insulting God. He's placing himself in the position of God by acting as if, rightfully, he has the authority to forgive sins. And they say only the one God, Hes ha-theos, can forgive sins. And so, the reason why I quote the CEB here, the Common English Bible, is because most say God alone can forgive sins, or only God can forgive sins. But as I read, the Greek here is Hes ha-theos, so it's the same vocabulary words from the Shema. And so the CEB does a good job of translating it more literally than most other translations by saying only the one God can forgive sins. But the theological point that's being made here by Yeshua and by Mark is that Yeshua is positioning himself as the God of the Shema. And so that, of course, is very crucial and essential to the theology of the New Testament, and the Shema is being used to communicate the identity of Yeshua. So now a little bit more background before going to the next one, and that is Malachi 2:10. So not only do Second Temple Jewish authors and the New Testament allude to and abbreviate the Shema, but even some places in the Tanakh do as well. Malachi 2:10 is one of those places. Another place is Zechariah 14:9, but we'll get to that when we do a video on the Aleinu. So Malachi 2:10 says, "Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why then are we faithless to one another, profaning the covenant of our fathers?" So I just want to point this out to show that Malachi made a little tweak to the Shema, a little addition to it, and that is by saying one Father. So again, if you look at the Septuagint, Malachi uses the Greek word for father there, pater, and so his abbreviation of the Shema now contains pater, father. So I want to point that out because the next passage in the New Testament I want to show is John 10:30, where Yeshua famously says, "I and the Father are one." So this is a very pithy statement by Yeshua where he's bringing what was more so implied or described in Mark 2 in an actual claim, a very straightforward claim of who he is, and that is that he is the God of the Shema. Yeshua and the Father are one. And so this leads right into what was actually most likely early liturgy of the Yeshua following community very early on in the first century. So this is from the letter of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 8:6. So some scholars think that this is actually early liturgy that Paul is simply preserving in his letter. So it's not that Paul came up with this sentence himself, but that he is quoting early liturgy of the Jesus following community in this letter. And as we see, it is some form of the Shema, which says, "Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Yeshua Messiah, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." So, of course, the early community of Yeshua followers recognized Yeshua as the God of the Shema. And this is a text that we'll talk more about in the Aleinu in the New Testament. But I just wanted to draw your attention to it because it also shows how important the Shema was to the early community, because this was most likely liturgy for them as well. So Dr. BJ Oropeza from Azusa Pacific University, I think I spelled his name wrong. I think it's Oropeza. He says this about the modification of the Shema in 1 Corinthians 8. He says, "In this reconfiguration of the Shema, it appears as though Paul, or an earlier Christian tradition he recites, has split the Lord your God is one Lord from Deuteronomy 6:4, Septuagint, and attributed God to the Father and God's name as Lord to Jesus Christ. The one God, as it were, becomes both the one Father and the one Lord Jesus Christ. God is the Father and creator of all things in heaven and earth, which derive their existence from him, and it was through the agency of the pre-existent Jesus Christ that this was accomplished." Cross-reference Colossians 1:15 through 18. So now, the next text that we see a allusion to the Shema in the New Testament is Ephesians 4:4 through 6. It says, "There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." So Dr. David Kramer, professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Jewish scholar, not Messianic Jewish, he wrote the notes in the Jewish Annotated New Testament on the letter to the Ephesians. And on this verse, he says, "This text clearly plays on Deuteronomy 6:4, which became in the same period the central rabbinic statement of faith, Mishnah Berachot 1. This repetitive formulation is reminiscent of the received rabbinic Sabbath afternoon prayer, 'You are one and your name is one, and who is like your people Israel, one unique nation on the earth.'" So you notice in Ephesians and also in this prayer that Dr. Kramer cites that there's this repeated one trope in consecutive order in Ephesians, in a verse, in the prayer, in the blessing. And this repeated oneness trope was actually also common in the Second Temple period. So Ephesians is not unique here. Of course, the precise content is quite unique, but this using one in repetitive nature, in a repetitive form, was not unique. Again, we turn to Josephus in Jewish Antiquities 4.200 to 201. He says, "Let there be one holy city in that place in the land of Canaan, and let there be one temple therein, and one altar of stones, and no other city let there be either altar or temple, for God is one, and the Hebrew race is one." So just like Ephesians, just one, we see Josephus doing the same thing. So the next one is Romans 3:29 through 30, where Paul says, "Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one. Who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith? Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law." So again, I'll talk about this more in the Aleinu in the New Testament, but this is a verse where Paul is using the Shema himself in a very pivotal statement in regards to the community of God in faith, of Jews and Gentiles. So about this, Dr. Mark Nanos, Jewish scholar from Lund University, he says, "At the center of Paul's theological opposition to the proselyte conversion of non-Jews is the central Jewish theology of the one God as declared in the Shema Israel. Paul thus argues that the one God of Jews, of Israel, is also the one God of the members of the other nations, when they turn to God by way of faithfulness to Christ, in keeping with the expectations from Torah for the end of the ages, Romans 3:29 through 31. According to Paul's logic, the declaration that this age has arrived with the resurrection of Christ would be undermined if those from the other nations were now to become Israelites, for then God would only be the God of the Israelites, implying that God is not the only God of all the nations. So I'll go more in depth in this in the Landing in the New Testament video, but I just wanted to show how pervasive the Shema is in the New Testament text and how crucial it is to New Testament theology. We see the Shema is used for the identity of Yeshua as being the God of the Shema, and here as central to Paul's understanding of the ecclesia, the family of Yeshua followers, Jews and Gentiles. These are two massively important topics in the New Testament, of course, and the Shema is central to them both. But not only are the words of the Shema used in the New Testament, but we also see that that ritual objects related to the Shema are found in the New Testament in some pretty interesting and significant ways. So, of course, those objects are tzitzit, tefillin, and mezuzah. Now, there's no mention of mezuzah in the New Testament that I'm aware of, so we will talk about tzitzit and tefillin. But just to show that these were ritual objects that were common in the Second Temple period, just as by way of example, we'll go to a letter of Aristeas, where he talks in brief measure, mentioning all three of these things. This is from paragraphs 158 through 159. He says, "He has set us a mark of remembrance in our clothing, and similarly he has ordained for us that we place the chapters upon our doorposts and gates to serve as a remembrance of God. He has expressly bidden us to bind them for a sign upon the hands, signifying plainly that every action must be carried out with justice, and that we must retain remembrance of our composition, and above all, fear of God." So there, remembrance in the clothing, tzitzit, ordained for us that we place the chapters upon our doorposts, mezuzah, and expressly bidden us to bind them as a sign upon the hands is tefillin. So to start with tzitzit, of course, this derives originally from Numbers 15, 37 through 41, which is the third paragraph of the Shema. And so it begins by saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages." So if you look on the slide here, I put the Hebrew and the Greek for fringes. So the Hebrew is kanaf, and the Greek for fringes is kraspadon. And I'll explain why I did that right now. So fringes are kraspadon in the Septuagint version of Numbers 15. So when we look at Luke 8:43 through 44, this also happens in Matthew 9:20 and Mark 5:25 through 29. It is the woman being healed of blood flow. She says, or Luke says, "And there was a woman with a blood flow for 12 years who could not be healed by anyone. She came up from behind and touched the fringe, kraspadon, of Yeshua's garment. Immediately her blood flow stopped." So some translations, I believe this is ESV, so they do pretty good of saying fringe. The TLV, Tree of Life version, will straight up kind of translate it as tzitzit, tzitziot, something like that. So they'll transliterate it into the Hebrew. But fringe works because it's also how the Tanakh is translated in this passage. But Yeshua's wearing tzitzit here. Some translations are more vague and more obscure, and they say touch the corner of his garment. So it's not very suggestive of tzitzit, but that's why I wanted to point out kraspadon. So Luke uses the same word for fringe as Numbers 15 does here. So Yeshua wore tzitzit, and which meant he made public expression that he was a Jewish man dedicated to observing the Torah and of remembering the God's salvation out of Egypt. So not only is that significant, but I want to make a little case here. This isn't unique to me. I read it in a few different places. But going back to Numbers 15, the Hebrew is kanaf. So we can ask the question, okay, this is kind of a strange story. Why would the woman think that if only she could touch Yeshua's tzitzit, that she would be healed? Like, that's kind of a strange notion to have. Why would she think that? And so there's a possible theory, or there is a theory, that possibly she had this connection between the kanaf, the fringes of Numbers 15, and the kanaf of Malachi 4, 1 through 2. So Malachi 4, 1 through 2 is a Messianic passage. We know for two reasons, at least. One is talking about the day of the Lord that's coming. But then most significantly, verse 5 says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." So, of course, Elijah is predecessor of the Messiah. This is often reflected in medieval Jewish Haggadot, where it shows Elijah and the Messiah traveling together. And so Malachi 4 is a Messianic passage here. And it says, "For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings." Kanaf. "You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." So kanaf could be translated either as fringes or as wings, but it's the same word. And here we see in this Messianic passage that there is healing in the wings, or the kanaf, or you can also understand it in the tzitzit. So perhaps that's the idea that this woman had. She's like, oh, Yeshua is the Messiah. There's healing in his wings. There's healings in his kanaf. There's healing in his tzitzit. If I can touch it, then I will be healed. And her faith healed her. And so I think that's really cool. I think there's something to that. And even as far as the connection between wings and tzitzit, there's a blessing that once a Jewish man dons the tallis, he wraps it over his head, and there's a blessing that actually thanks God for the protection of being underneath his wings, as you're wearing the tzitzit, wearing the tallis over your head. So there's even a physical expression that is done commonly when the tallis is being donned by a Jewish man today. So I think this is a really cool connection. So not only is it significant that Yeshua, Jewish man, wore tzitzit, publicly declaring his dedication to observing the commandments, but this passage here in Luke also shows the messianic significance of this woman being healed by touching Yeshua's tzitzit. Now for the tefillin. So tefillin derives from Deuteronomy 6:8, which says, "You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes." So you see this picture here, this illustration rather, of a man. He has a leather box on his forehead, and can't really see it here, but there's another leather box on his arm and the leather straps going around. So this, for thousands of years, has been a way for Jewish men to fulfill Deuteronomy 6:8. And we know it's been for thousands of years because we have found tefillin at Qumran. So Qumran, the caves of Qumran in Israel, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Maybe you've heard of Dead Sea Scrolls. There's also tefillin that were found that look pretty much like the tefillin that Jewish men still use today. And even in these ancient tefillin, we see many of the same scrolls that modern tefillin contain. such as Exodus 13, 1 through 10, 11 through 16, and of course Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, which has the Shema, and Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21, so the second paragraph of the Shema. So 7 of these tefillin were found in one mezuzah, and some of them contained additional commandments, or additional passages, such as the 10 Commandments, which we see also from other Jewish artifacts of the time, that the Shema is often paired with the 10 Commandments. So tefillin was present, and I think in widespread use during the first century time period. And we see Yeshua talk about them in Matthew 23:5. So this is from TLV. It says, "All their works they do to be noticed by men. They make their tefillin wide and their tzitzit long." So in other translations, they'll say something like, they make their phylacteries wide and their fringes long. But of course, phylacteries is tefillin, fringes is tzitzit. And so Yeshua is rebuking some Pharisees for kind of being showy with their tefillin and their tzitzit. Of course, we know Yeshua wore tzitzit, as we just read in Luke 8 and in other places. But you could ask, did he also wear tefillin? So we know it's kind of widespread, but nowhere in the New Testament does it directly mention that he wore tefillin. But Jewish scholar, modern Orthodox Jewish scholar, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, she makes a fun suggestion and implication from this verse here in Matthew 23:5. She said that Jesus, according to Matthew 23:5, criticizes the Pharisees and scribes because they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, suggests that his phylacteries were narrow and his fringes shorter. So I think that's a pretty creative implication. Maybe there's something to that. Whether there's something to what Dr. Amy Jill Levine is saying or not. Personally, I do think that Yeshua wore tefillin. It was widespread enough. There's really no reason to think that he didn't. And maybe to her point, if there's something wrong with wearing tefillin, he would rebuke the Pharisees for wearing tefillin at all. But he is just criticizing the intention behind it and the length of it. So maybe Dr. Levine is onto something here. But nevertheless, we see that the Shema is alluded to, it is quoted all throughout the New Testament, and these ritual objects associated with the Shema play significant roles in the New Testament, especially the tzitzit. So by the end of this survey of the Shema in the New Testament, we see that the central prayer of Judaism is pervasive and, yes, central to the New Testament. We as Messianic Jews should feel very firm in our identity as Messianic Jews. The Jewishness of our faith in Yeshua, the Messiah, and our adherence to the New Testament is deep. When we pray the Shema at home, at our synagogue, or when visiting non-Messianic synagogues, we can meditate on the depths of the Shema from Deuteronomy and all throughout the New Testament. I'll have videos on the Amidah, the Aleinu, and the Kaddish in the New Testament, covering all the major blessings of a Jewish prayer service, so we can see that when Jewish people come to follow Jesus, we are not abandoning our Jewishness, we are continuing it. And this was not even an exhaustive list of verses that draw from the Shema. Check out Laurie Barron's book, The Shema in John's Gospel, for a very far-reaching survey of the Shema in the Tanakh, Second Temple literature, and in the New Testament. I'll also put some links to other great articles and chapters in the description below to continue your study. If this was informative or uplifting for you, please subscribe and share with your friends, and keep an eye out for more videos like this. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.